Hi, Zach Smith here with Fiorentino Pair Anchor. Let's talk about trip lines. A trip line, also known as a recovery line, is how we are able to recover our parachute sea anchor when we're done using it. It makes it a lot easier to bring back on board. Essentially, we have a polypropylene rope. We like floating rope, which is why it's polypropylene. I like to use 3/8 to 1/2 inch. One end of that polypropylene line will be connected to the apex, which is the top of your parachute sea anchor. And anywhere from 50 to 100 feet further away, we have a big boat fender, usually something you use for docking. I always use the same fender I use for docking to attach to the end of my trip line. I like to add 2 floats. I learned this from commercial fisherman Gerard Fiorentino, that anytime something's close to the boat, it's great to have commercial fishing floats attached to it. So 25 feet away from the top of the parachute, I normally have some kind of support float. And you can also use a small boat fender. It doesn't have to be a commercial fishing float. And what that float does, it helps pull the trip line off the canopy if it happens to get caught on it. That's usually, this happens when you get overly excited deploying a parachute sea anchor in a storm for the first time in your life. You just kind of throw everything in the water, versus what you should be doing, which is you drop, and this is for any manufacturer, you drop the trip line in the water first, make sure your boat drifts away from that trip line before you deploy the parachute anchor, followed by your anchor rod. So that is the main reason I have a support float, just in case you happen to throw everything in the water at the same time. That helps, like I said, pull the trip line off the parachute canopy. The trick in recovering your parachute basically is you're going to motor up towards that float at the end of the trip line. So you're hauling in your anchor rope, you're stacking it on deck, and as you get to that boat fender, you will boat hook that, and as soon as that trip line's in your hand, you're going to start hauling that in hand over hand. It spins the chute around and it closes like an umbrella, and now all you're bringing on board is the weight of the parachute and what's left of the anchor rope in the water. You have the option either to acquire a trip line from the manufacturer or build one yourself. If you happen to purchase a trip line from Fiorentino Pair Anchor, we'll go ahead and connect it for you. But if you happen to purchase the trip line after the fact, let me show you how you can connect Fiorentino's trip line to the parachute anchor. It includes 2 clamps. The first one has 2 stainless screws. Let me go ahead and loosen that. What you do is you grab the 3/8 inch polypropylene, and I like soft braid trip lines because they're easier to pack. So you bring the trip line through all the crisscross lines, which are on the apex, the top of the parachute anchor. And there's some spikes here within the clamp itself that allow me to press down on them. Kind of holds your trip line a little bit in place. And there are a couple, I'm trying to keep these circular openings. That's what we're going to anchor the screw in a second. And then, there we go. I try to push down really hard. I can also use a pair of pliers. There we go. I think I felt that one connect. And if for some reason you're struggling, you're like, gosh darn it, I can't seem to get the screws to connect, you'll just have to pull the clamps apart again, because sometimes what will happen is the poly rope gets in the way when you're trying to screw in the clamps. Also, what I do, if it looks like there's going to be any kind of rope sticking out, I'll kind of press it in there, because I don't want to pinch the rope if I can avoid pinching the rope through here. And then I'm going to keep tightening these. There we go. I actually met the parents, the original owners who developed these clamps. They're actually located in California, and they have now since retired, and I work with their son to acquire these clamps. Pretty nifty. Now that it's secure, we used to have a fire hose or some kind of hose to help reduce chafe. Turns out it doesn't really make any difference, so we go ahead and disconnect it straight on rope on rope. Some of the fishermen that use this equipment a whole lot, eventually you'll get kind of this fuzzy look on that rope, so it never breaks, so we never have any issues of breakage. So that's nothing to be concerned about if you happen to buy a used parachute, for example. Now the opposite end on the 50-foot, I like to have either use a 50-foot or 100-foot diameter, or I'm sorry, length of trip line. And on the opposite end of our trip line, we have these little cool hand clamps. That way we can attach a boat fender. You just connect it, like, look at that, nice and solid. And I grab my boat fender, I run that through like so, clamp that down, there we go. That way I can interchangeably use fenders that I'm using for docking. It's one way of saving storage space and money, because you don't have to buy an extra float that way for the parachute sea anchor system. Now, again, I like the soft braid for connection on the trip lines. We used to use, Fiorentina used to use a more stiffer polypropylene. It's a great rope. It's really easy to handle. I like it. It's just the soft braid's a little bit simpler to pack, and if you happen to get some twists in it, it's easy to clear those lines. Now, if you want to rig your own trip line, build your own trip line, there are a number of different ways that you can connect the trip line to it. So a lot of times you can have a little spliced eye like this with a shackle. You can connect to that. I'm not worried about the parachute spinning, too much. So even if you get a couple twists on here, it's not going to be an issue for the trip line. The trip line is not really important other than recovering your parachute sea anchor. Some people, especially a lot of fishermen, they want something that they can connect to real fast. I wouldn't recommend it for heavy weather use, but if you want to have some drift fishing techniques and be able to clamp something really fast like that, that's a nice approach. One thing I do want to mention is I have a lot of fishermen that will call me up out of Florida, and they're fishing in shallower waters. And they're saying, well, geez, what if I'm in 20 feet of water and won't the parachute get caught on a coral reef or something like that? So, well, in that case, why don't you go ahead and form a simple loop knot. And what you do, it can be any boat fender. I just happen to have one with the clamp ready to go. I could shackle a fender on it, I can tie it off, but basically, because I have this about, say, 15, maybe 10 feet away from the parachute, that extra flotation keeps the parachute from sinking too much. So that way I don't have to worry about dragging on the bottom. So for shallow water purposes, that's why we have that kind of setup. I also wanted to mention, which I failed to mention earlier, when the water becomes very muddy, or you can't see very well, what's nice about the two floats, and my first support float is going to be midway on the trip line. So if I have a 50-foot trip line, it's going to be connected at the 25-foot mark. And then the tail end of the trip line, of course, on the 50-foot is where you have your boat fender. The fenders kind of tell you where the parachute anchor is located. So if you can't see it because it's sinking or the water's too muddy, you kind of know from that support float. If you see the support float, oh, it's 25 feet away from that. And the good news is the wind always pushes the floats away from the parachute system. So as you're heading towards that end float to recover the parachute, you know you're downwind from that parachute anchor, which is great because there's always going to be wind and waves. If this is for after storm use, all those wind and waves have a tendency to push your boat away from everything that way versus over, lines. Now, other companies are going to have different recommendations. I went and looked at the websites recently. I have the manuals of the various companies, and they're all over the board on what their recommendations are going to be for trip lines. So anytime you buy an accessory from the company, ask them to be clear about what it is you're acquiring, because some people didn't have information on trip lines. Some manufacturers said 200 feet or more, so those are good questions to ask. Some say we're only going to use a 1/4 inch trip line, and that's fine because, like I said, there's not a lot of loading on the equipment, but it's a little bit harder to handle, especially in cold weather when you're trying to recover chutes. Now, some suppliers of the parachute sea anchors have what they call a float line or a sink line, where they connect a deployment bag to the parachute itself, followed by their trip line. What I've noticed is when I've used this equipment, frequently what ends up happening is we have oscillation. That means there's the parachute anchor is relaxing, reinflating, rope is becoming slack, rope is loading up again, and that causes parachutes to flatten out a little bit. But with these bags, the deployment bags that are so close to the parachutes, sometimes they're getting caught in the shroud lines or in one instance I had a parachute completely tangled when I was deploying it. I was only doing a regular photo shoot for a comparison article. And, I'll blame myself. Maybe I didn't pack it perfectly, after using it. So maybe that's why it tangled. But that's just something to be aware of. If you really want to eliminate any kind of potential deployment bag wrapping around your parachute, and this is not a Fiorentina. Fiorentina doesn't have deployment bags with their parachutes. Just add about 10 pounds of chain. that will eliminate a lot of that problem because it reduces the oscillation on the parachute anchor itself. It also eliminates the issue of deployment bags floating too long because they get air pockets in these bags, and sometimes they float quite a while. And if you have breaking seas for storm use, for example, they can partially eject, and that could create potential issues. I've seen the deployment bags wrapped around shroud lines. That doesn't bother me. What bothers me is if the float line is made the deployment bag so short it'll completely choke out the parachute canopy seal. It'll almost be completely tangled in that circumstance. It really should make the bags connected further away from the parachute itself. That might eliminate that particular issue. Don't be afraid to buy a parachute anchor with a deployment bag. These are just things I want you to be aware of. Add the weight. That really that's one of the elements of Fiorentino's constant road tension method. So you do that, you're going to more than likely be fine. I also had a customer one time contact Fiorentino, and they wanted us to do a repair on their parachute sea anchor. It wasn't a Fiorentino brand, it was another brand, but apparently they claim, and I don't know if they were accurate or not, that a trip line was attached to the top of the parachute with a shackle, and when they tied it down with a wire, the wire stuck out. So that is something, if you're going to use wire ties on parachute anchors or any equipment where there's fabric or rope involved, just bear in mind if there's a sharp edge like that can slice open the parachute canopy, which is why we had to make the repair for that particular. I'm not going to blame the manufacturers. I don't think they would have actually wire tied something like that. You use a plastic tie. That'll be less likely to be an issue of cutting anything. If you have any further questions, please leave a comment. I'm going to continue shooting more how-to videos or fact-based videos. If you have ideas for that, you can add that in the comment as well. Thank you so much for watching.